Welcome to the Explainer. We all use it, right? We all want more of it, and we interact with it literally every single day. But how often do you actually stop and think about the physical cash sitting in your wallet? The journey of the American dollar is this incredible story filled with global empires, rebellious printers, devastating wars, and just unimaginable global power. Okay, let's dive into this, because the history behind this everyday piece of paper is absolutely fascinating.
So to really understand the dollar, we actually have to travel far away from the United States and way back in time. Like how exactly did a 16th century Bohemian silver mine end up naming America's currency? Well, the answer lies with a guy named Count Hieronymus Schlick. Back in 1519, the Count discovered this massive, rich vein of silver near his estate in a valley known as Joachimsthal. He decided, hey, I'm going to mint my very own coins from this silver. And that one simple act set off this massive linguistic chain reaction that would eventually span the entire globe.
Section 1. The birth of the dollar. Okay, so we start in 1519 with those coins from the Bohemian Valley, which were called Joachimsthalers. Now, obviously, that is a bit of a mouthful, right? So over the course of the 16th century, the name was naturally shortened by traders to just thaler, or the Italian tallarero. Because these big silver coins were so consistent and reliable, the word thaler basically became the generic term for any large silver coin across Europe. Now let's fast forward to the 1700s over in the Americas. The British colonists weren't actually using British pounds because England outlawed the export of their currency to the colonies. So what did they do? The colonists had to rely really heavily on Spanish silver pesos coming up out of Mexico. These pesos were worth 8 reals, which is exactly why pirates famously called them pieces of 8. But to the American colonists, who were already used to that European terminology for big silver coins, they were simply known as dollars. And eventually, in 1792, that nickname just became official.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is that despite the dollar sign being one of the most recognizable symbols on the planet, nobody knows for absolute certain where it actually came from. But historians do have two leading theories, and both of them tie right back to those Spanish pesos. The first theory, it suggests that hurried bookkeepers were writing down PS as an abbreviation for peso, and over time they just started scrunching the letters together, kind of blurring them into that iconic dollar symbol we know today. The second theory actually points to the imagery on the back of the Spanish coin itself. It featured the Pillar of Hercules wrapped with an S-shaped banner. Honestly, whichever one it is, the DNA of the modern US dollar is undeniably Spanish.
Section 2. Rebels and paper money.
So the big problem in early America was that physical coinage was incredibly hard to come by. Any silver that did enter the colonies usually went straight back to Europe to pay for imported goods. This massive lock of cash was just completely stifling the local economy. Enter a young printer in Philadelphia in 1729. Seeing this crisis, he wrote a pamphlet fiercely advocating for paper currency. This printer, who by the way gave us the famous quote, "Time is money," was none other than Benjamin Franklin. Franklin actually landed contracts to print paper money for Pennsylvania, but the British Crown saw this as a massive threat to their authority and eventually outlawed the use of paper money in America altogether. It was a stubborn, highly unpopular move that really helped fuel the fires of the coming rebellion.
But here's the thing. You cannot finance a revolution without cash. So the newly formed Continental Congress just boldly authorized the printing of millions of paper notes, which they called continental currency. Initially, they promised a 1-to-1 value with the Spanish silver dollar. But there was a huge catch. As the war dragged on, they just kept printing more and more and more of them. The result? Total hyperinflation. The purchasing power of the Continental absolutely plummeted, which birthed the famous saying from that era, "Not worth a Continental." So yeah, the revolution was won with paper money, but the American public felt entirely burned by the economic chaos it left behind.
Section 3. Forging a national currency. Because the American people had been so burned by the Continentals, the Founding Fathers basically decided to avoid paper money entirely. In fact, they didn't even mention paper money in the Constitution. Instead, through the Coinage Act of 1792, they established a formal, federally regulated physical coinage system, and they made a brilliant forward-thinking decision here. Instead of adopting that highly confusing British system of pounds, shillings, pence, and farthings, they created the world's very first fully decimal currency. Following Thomas Jefferson's suggestion, the dollar was neatly divided into 100 equal parts, using the Latin word for 100, cents.
Let's take a really quick detour for some fun trivia. We all constantly refer to dollars as bucks, but why? Well, the slang actually comes from 19th century Ohio. Because formal coins were still super scarce out on the frontier, animal skins were heavily used in trade. They created a standardized price equivalent where one full buckskin was equal to exactly $1. And just like that, the buck was born. 10,000.
I really want you to let that staggering number sink in for a second. Without a strong federal paper money system in place, individual states and local banks basically just started issuing their own banknotes. By the time we were creeping up on the American Civil War, there were roughly 10,000 different types of paper money circulating across the United States. I mean, it was an absolute logistical nightmare for daily trade, and it made it incredibly difficult for the federal government to actually raise funds when the war finally broke out.
Section 4. Civil War and Greenbacks.
So to finance the Union Army, Abraham Lincoln's administration had to start printing federal paper money again in 1861. He handed this monumental task to his Treasury Secretary, a highly ambitious politician named Salmon P. Chase. Now, Chase had actually run against Lincoln for the Republican nomination and lost, but he definitely never let go of his presidential aspirations. So when it came time to design the very first federal $1 bill, who did Chase decide to feature? Himself. He boldly slapped his own portrait right on the front of the money, just to boost his political profile. These notes were printed with green ink on the back, which quickly earned them their famous nickname, Greenbacks.
War is unimaginably expensive, and this conflict just drastically impacted the economies of both the North and the South. Both sides were forced to print money that couldn't be instantly exchanged for gold or silver. The value rested entirely on the promise that the government would redeem it after they won the war. Up north, the heavy printing caused the value of greenbacks to drop to about 1/3 of their face value. But down south, the situation was far, far more severe. The Confederacy printed more than twice as many notes. By 1865, a $10 Confederate bill, often called the Dixie, had plummeted so drastically that it could literally only buy about 1 or 2 cents worth of actual goods. When the war ended, Confederate money became entirely worthless paper, while the North's greenbacks survived and became a trusted standard.
Section 5. Moving to a fiat currency.
Let's move to and see how this builds over the next century, transforming from physical metal to pure government promise. Originally, the dollar was strictly defined as a specific weight of pure silver. That was the silver standard. But by the 1850s, gold became much more prominent, and the U.S. officially shifted toward a de facto gold standard in the 1870s, meaning your paper money was literally backed by physical gold sitting in a vault somewhere. But throughout the 20th century, that connection between paper and precious metals got weaker and weaker. Finally, in 1971, the Nixon administration completely severed the dollar's connection to gold. That was the final step, transforming the US dollar into a pure fiat currency.
So what does fiat currency actually mean in plain English? It's money whose value is based strictly on the public's faith in their government. There is zero gold or silver backing it up. A $100 bill is literally just a piece of paper and some ink. It only holds value because we all collectively agree that it does. And while that might sound a little fragile at first, it's actually incredibly powerful. It allows the government and the Federal Reserve to actively manage the economy. Because they aren't tied to physical metal reserves, Congress and the Fed can print extra money to respond swiftly to massive, unexpected economic crises, exactly like they did during the recent coronavirus pandemic. Now, because fiat money relies entirely on public trust, the faces we put on our bills actually matter a lot. They're designed to project a sense of confidence and deep stability. But there is one strict rule stemming all the way back from our anti-royal origins. The person must be a deceased historical figure. While the faces on our money have remained largely static for decades, changes do occasionally happen. For instance, back in 2016, the Treasury Department announced that the famed abolitionist Harriet Tubman would be placed on the $20 bill, replacing Andrew Jackson. However, in 2019, the Trump administration announced that this specific design change would be delayed by at least a decade.
Section 6. The Global Reserve Powerhouse. And this brilliantly illustrates just how far the dollar has come from its chaotic colonial origins. Emerging from World War II as an absolute economic titan, the US dollar officially replaced the British pound as the world's global reserve currency in 1945. What that means is global banks and governments basically keep more US dollars on hand than any other currency. Today, its footprint is just massive. It's the official local currency in 7 independent non-US countries. On top of that, 13 other nations actively peg their own currency to the US dollar just to stabilize their local economies, effectively tying their own financial fate directly to the greenback.
To really put the scale of this global reliance into perspective, I want you to look at this number: $5.1 trillion. Because the US dollar is a floated currency, its value fluctuates every single second based on global supply and demand. That $5.1 trillion, that is the daily, yes, daily volume of the foreign exchange market where the dollar is traded. It is quite literally the heartbeat of global commerce.
And despite the rise of things like digital banking, crypto, and credit cards, the sheer volume of physical paper money being created is still astronomical. In 2018 alone, the Federal Reserve submitted an order to the Bureau of Engraving and Printing for roughly 7.4 billion new physical notes. The total face value of just that single year's printing order, $233.4 billion.
We basically treat the dollar like it's a force of nature, like water or air. But as we've seen today, it's an entirely human invention. It evolved from Bohemian silver to pirate coins. It survived rebellions and civil wars, and it eventually broke free from gold entirely. It is a tool constantly redesigned to meet the exact needs of the moment. But since our modern fiat currency is backed by absolutely nothing except our collective trust in the system, I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. What actions, policies, or global shifts will shape the value of the dollars sitting in your pocket tomorrow? Thanks for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking questions, and I'll catch you next time.